Hey everybody, Tim Kawakami here for the good old TK show, recording from the home studio. Really glad to have on as my guest, my friend, athletic compatriot, whatever that word is, also Odyssey compatriot. We are kind of twinned here, Richard. I really do like that. It's media columnist, you know him, national media columnist, voice among all this, Richard Deitsch. Richard, how you doing today?
Doing good, Tim. We are. We're sharing two employers right now, which I'm not sure how many people I share two employers with. I think you are the only one.
If there's anybody to share two employers with, it's Richard Deitsch. I will say that, and have been a nice voice of experience for me on certain things. So I really appreciate that, Richard. We're just got to say, coming off I might say the biggest night in women's college basketball history. I was tuned into the pregame shows. There was electricity to that. We can talk about, I thought ESPN's pregame show, I think you mentioned it, was terrific. It felt big. The games, obviously, Iowa-LSU was humongous, but UConn-USC felt huge too. Everything felt big about it. Richard, just your reaction to it. Where do you think this goes in the Final Four? Is it unfortunate that it happened before the Final Four, or was it good that it happened before the Final Four?
It's a good question. I think we'll probably find out once we get the Final Four and title game viewership numbers. It was a phenomenal night for women's basketball, and it unquestionably the greatest night in the history of the sport prior to a Final Four. Then once you get to the Final Four part, then it becomes a little subjective as to, sort of what Final Fours maybe in the past you thought were transcendent. But I don't think, Tim, we've ever had a bigger event night in women's college basketball than we had with those two games. As we're taping this, the viewership numbers for Iowa-LSU are not in, but there's a real chance that they could beat last year's title game. And last year's title game, which drew 9.9 million viewers, is the unicorn of all viewership numbers. It blew away everything previous in terms of the sport. And then the USC-UConn game was phenomenal, maybe even a better game, quite frankly, just in terms of like competitiveness than the earlier game. And that should do 5-6 million viewers with that lead in. So, whether you want to go by sort of vibes, whether you want to go by metrics, this tournament has been very different for women's basketball. Everything feels like an event. Everything feels bigger. The sport is just in an unbelievable place. Whether it can last in a post-Caitlin Clark world, I don't think we're going to see these numbers next year, but I do think you get enough people to sample the product and some stay. And that's what you're ultimately trying to do, is you're trying to grow things. And I do think that unquestionably will happen, but we've just never seen these kind of numbers before. Again, the one number we do know, Iowa, Colorado, Sweet 16 game, 6.9 million viewers. That essentially beats every NCAA title game prior to last year. So, we're dealing in numbers, viewership and metrics numbers for women's basketball that just we've never seen. It's like, this is unicorn kind of stuff.
You have been predicting these big numbers. I saw you predicting over 8 before the games for Iowa-LSU.
I think I'm low.
Yeah, it might be 10. I mean, 10 is what? That's Ohio State football game, right? That's a great college football number.
Correct.
And we're seeing college football contort itself and break itself apart trying to get those numbers that women's basketball may or may not deliver. Well, we know it's going to be high. It's going to be really high. Richard, just, we're two old media columnists. I used to be one. I still sometimes think like that. I mentioned how big the broadcast felt, and I know you've been great about these games should be on ABC. They should be, and they're not. They're on the cable. That reduces the numbers at some point. But still, I thought Ryan Ruocco and Rebecca Lobo were fantastic. Thought the pregame show was really good. I mentioned that. It just wasn't rinky-dink, right? It wasn't thrown together. It was, and some of it, if you report, Holly Rowe has been basically following Caitlin Clark in Iowa the whole time. Were you, did it exceed your expectations? What goes into it for them to make it feel that big?
Yeah, it matched my expectations, which to me is a win. The reason why everything felt big is because Ryan Ruocco, Rebecca Lobo, and Holly Rowe have done the biggest games of that sport for many, many years. So the moment's not going to be too big for them. It's like when Joe Buck or Jim Nantz or Mike Tirico do a Super Bowl, like you don't expect it to be too big. They've done it already, even if the game is going to be watched by 120 million people. So the The announce crew is very, very good. They know every team nationally pretty cold. They've done their games already. And then where they found magic, Tim, is in the studio. Like Chiney Ogwumike and Andrea Carter just have great chemistry together. Like they're both young, they're both current. Chiney remains a WNBA player, so like literally significant currency. Andrea Carter is one of Pat Summitt's last recruits, so she's not so far removed from playing college basketball. They're both under 30, 32, I think. And then Elle Duncan has always been a traditionally very good host, sort of solid and lets others around her sort of highlight. Carolyn Peck will join them for the Final Four. Again, championship winning coach, has been a part of that sport forever. So they made really smart personnel decisions, in my opinion, to like put people who know the sport. The thing I have always appreciated about ESPN's women basketball coverage, even when I was getting on them for not putting the games in better programming windows like ABC, and, you sometimes get games on ESPN2 or ESPNU, is terrible. They do treat the sport like they treat you as a viewer like an adult based on who they hire to provide you the games. They're not junking it up like, oh, let's bring Michael Strahan on to talk about soccer. Do you know what I mean? Like we have people who play the sport, who know the sport, who respect the sport, and these are the people who are going to analyze the sport and broadcast the sport. And they've now just like got to a place where they have so many more people watching. And I think there's just people who watch like that studio show and they're like, wow, like these women know their shit. Like, yeah, they know that because they've been in the sport for 15 years. I just think there's some people who've just never seen them and are blown away by it. And then lastly, and this is a big thing, and I know you know this, Tim, just from like writing media as well. Sometimes you just got to get lucky that the group likes each other, or just like inside the NBA it just works. Like they make fun of each other. They're funny, self-deprecating. And whatever it is with Chiney, Andrea, and Elle, it just works. They just have magic on camera. It doesn't always work that way, but it's working during this tournament. And you will see this group for the near term heading forward as your studio group for major NCAA women's games.
In my own kind of big picture way, I almost feel like some of the controversies, and we'll talk about the controversies, but that almost is proof of concept. Like you can't be controversial if people aren't watching you. Who cares about Kim Mulkey if the games aren't huge, if she's not the defending national champion, if she doesn't have great players? Now there's some things that they've gone through, good and bad, that you can judge on its own. But even like Rebecca Lobo's offhand Albany comment, which which I laughed about, like it
was funny.
Yeah, and yet the mayor reacts whatever, and I'll go, oh, you better watch your words. But people are like, you know what? Barkley says this stuff all the time. We laugh, whoever. I think that's just some element of the bigness of this, that people are like, if in the past, if somebody made a comment about a city in the women's tournament, nobody would even know or even care. Let's get to Kim Mulkey, though. Like, in the most simplest of terms, she's been cast as the villain. She's a good person to watch and like, oh my God, what's she going to do next? Which I think is fascinating, and I think Ray Ratto compared her to Bob Knight, and I thought that was a great comparison. Like, you watched Bob Knight's teams at the best, when he was at his best. Clearly, Kim Mulkey is at the top of the profession. I'm sure you've dealt with her. You've covered a lot of college basketball, a lot of Final Fours. Did you think any of it was on? Now, other than the LA Times column, we'll talk about that. It's my former place. I was embarrassed by that column. It was basically retracted. I think someone who's the editor there should be responsible for this too, for allowing it to run. It's a whole other thing. But of the Kim Mulkey, we can agree that was a very nice and thorough piece in the Washington Post, it turns out, which we expected. But just her approach to this, the way she's viewed, Richard, as you know her a little bit, her place in the game. What has been your reaction to this, the big picture of it?
Yeah, so the Ratto comparison is interesting because I think there is a lot of Knight in her, although I think she is softer than Knight, quite frankly. I think Bobby Knight was a bully and quite frankly an asshole. A brilliant coach, but I wouldn't put Mulkey doesn't reach that level, but there's also only one Bob Knight. So we're talking sort of the highest sort of Mount Rushmore of that kind of figure. Kim Mulkey is incredibly stubborn and sort of has a belief in how she does things and will only do things sort of her way. she is not one who's going to adapt to the social media world that exists. She's very old school in just how she approaches stuff. She wants things a certain way. I think it'd be very hard to work for her as both an athletic director or an assistant coach unless you sort of accede to her wishes. I think she's a brilliant basketball coach, unquestionably so. Her players play hard. They play fast. She's a great recruiter. She always has been. But I thought Kent Babb's piece sort of nailed it. Like personally for me, there are things there's problematic things with her. I think she handled the Griner situation horrifically, quite frankly. And now maybe you could say, well, she's at Baylor. You have to sort of be political in how you handle it. I mean, I guess, but Kim Mulkey was also, I could argue, has more leverage than Baylor.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? She's the most famous coach on the campus, arguably other than the football coach. So, like, the bad piece was good because it gave people, I think, you may think that like it was too harsh on, we all have sort of issues maybe with our families that you don't want people to pry into. I think that's fair. I mean, there's a real question to be asked, like how much should we know about Kim Mulkey's relationship with her dad, and does that have anything to do with her team? Very fair question. That's something that editors sort of have to decide on stuff every day. But I do think it gave you like a real honest, like complex sort of look at sort of what drives her and sort of how she is and who she is. The LA Times piece wasn't any of that. The LA Times piece was the worst kind of hometown column where a writer who I think obviously probably knows better and has known better just used these like indefensible like comparisons. Tim, like once you start like playing the good versus evil, like sort of card in print, you've already lost. You know what I'm saying? Like that doesn't exist. This isn't Game of Thrones or Star Wars. Like these are human beings. Like you may not like a team, but they're not evil. You may love a team. You don't know if they're good or not. You're not with them every day. So that column was garbage, to be honest. And what kind of sucks is like, I think like the Mulkey story, like would have been interesting to sort of debate and talk about because it was an interesting, complex, like portrait of somebody, but she was absolutely right to take the high ground on that column about her for the LA Times. And I think that's what people, if anyone's going to remember like a piece, I think over the weekend, it's probably going to be the LA Times piece, right? It's not going to be the Post piece. And I feel like Mulkey had every right to call that out and to protect her players. And so, the Times was right to act. I know it's your former employer. They should have apologized. They've done great work historically as a newspaper. So I don't think it's something that happens every day, but that's one where you hope that somebody would have saved you from yourself. Both of us know as writers, you do need sometimes an editor to save you from like a bad idea or a bad concept. And that's one where you wish somebody had saved that writer.
Yeah, I'll just say it again. I think the LA Times sports editor should have apologized for that. That's on this editor's watch. That should never have appeared. I read the first 3 sentences. I was going, "Oh my god!" Like that was my reaction.
Once you read that, it was like, I can't believe this made it.
That can't. It wasn't something that snuck in in the middle of a column. And I felt it as a former LA Times staffer that this was wrong and it should have never happened. I know the writer Ben Bolch apologized for it, but the bigger picture was this was exactly what bad journalism is. That was it.
The one thing I would say is, I didn't mean to interrupt. The one thing I was just going to say is this, and I'm not trying to make an excuse for the writer or the newspaper, but both of us have been in places where you become enamored with like, let's write the kind of the hometown column. Do you know what I mean? Like, and everybody, very, very famous columnists, sports columnists have written this, since probably the beginning of newspapers. And like, there is a sort of a reasoning for it. It's because you want people who are reading your newspaper to sort of, get excited about that team. So I get like conceptually where it was coming from. The execution was horrific. And that's the thing. But like, growing up in New York, and I know, Tim, you're a West Coast guy. I can't tell you how many columns I read in the New York papers and the Boston papers, like pro Red Sox, pro Yankee, let's beat that. Beat LA. You know how many beat LA columns the East Coast writers like have written like in like historically. So I get where it was coming from. It just was, man, it was just bad. No.
Jim Murray, the LA Times, one of my heroes, did it humorously for years and years, was classic at it, but he did it with a lighter touch. Some of them weren't the greatest, but Jim, I'm going to say Jim Murray, who I will always look up to, have always looked up to, did it constantly. I will say I hate those columns.
Right.
And I just really hated them when I covered the Lakers. They'd come into a smaller town, and that column was sort of right. Oh, these Hollywood prima donnas, and they're off on, they're driving on the beach, and they're not. And like, this is so stupid. Just write about what's unique about each team. It's not Hollywood. It's some other thing. And it happened. Play the Jazz, that column would appear. You play the Spurs, that column would appear. You beat it every time. And it does happen with the Warriors sometimes, less so because Steph Curry is not that kind of figure, but it certainly happens with Draymond. And it's just like, I will never write something like that.
It's not just newspapers. I mean, how many times have we seen the ESPNs of the world, like, the Bad Boys versus Jordan, the Jordan, like, everybody sort of narratives it up. It's just, the problem is, like, it's a fine line, and if you cross that line, you're in trouble. Knock on wood, none of us at The Athletic do, but like, you can get in trouble for it.
Yeah, I do think my belief has always been, if you deliver it as down the middle as you can, people will read you in the future. Yes. You might, the one that you wrote right there got everybody stirred up, and you got 50,000 people who would read you anyway to read it. But you want the 2 million people who might just check in on you to consistently come back to you. Okay, this person was fair on this one. I'll read the next 20. That's my belief in media. Maybe it's old school, but that's the way I feel. Let's get into other media issues. Obviously, Richard, you're all over them. We just see the NFL just expanding and growing and eating up everything. I did not think they would continue the Christmas games if it wasn't near the weekend. You predicted they would, and you were right. So Wednesday this year, and they're going to do not one, but 2 Christmas games. This is at the end of a season. How they're going to juggle the schedule is beyond me. It will be unfair for teams at some point because they're going to be playing on short weeks. Richard, I guess you can say, hey, pat yourself on the back. You called this. Is there no limit on what the NFL will do in this scheduling? Are they going to come after everybody?
There's no limit. No. I mean, you just basically just always bet on the NFL expanding and making more money on its next rights deal, and you'll be correct on all this stuff. Where the NFL sort of, I think, was smart, Tim, is just like culturally at some point, people stop being upset about games being held on Christmas, right? Like, I think once upon a time in the 70s, I'm sure like newspapers got like letters, why are you playing a sporting event on this day? And I just think like the public doesn't, if people are upset, there's just not enough people upset anymore for the NFL to avoid it. The NFL doesn't care about the NBA. They don't care that the NBA owned that day. They see an opportunity. And their proof of concept was, look at some of these Christmas Day viewership numbers. Like, they don't want to leave that off the table. They know they can get places to bid on like one-off games. And so I don't think there's a day on the calendar, honestly, that they wouldn't try to approach, although there might be some days, obviously, that just are problematic, like scheduling wise, so you wouldn't do it. But, they have designs, Tim, on like expanding globally, right? So I think if and when they do that, if they end up in Munich or Mexico City or London, then I think the schedule just goes to places maybe we haven't seen before. The only thing I think they wouldn't do, and I think it's just congressional, is I just don't think they play on Friday night, just because I don't know if they want to go down that road of fighting with Congress. But quite frankly, like that could, I'm not predicting this, but they could also lobby Congress and just change what I'm saying? Like there maybe 10 years from now, like that doesn't even exist. And like high school football is not protected anymore. Although I don't think the NFL would want to do that because they need high school football to continue in order to supply the sport. So I don't see, I'm just sort of just on the top of my head. I don't know what they wouldn't expand to if they think there'd be interest in it. And then really they just, as long as they think the players will buy in, I just think scheduling wise, you're naive not to think they're going to go to 18 games at some point fairly soon. I just think like it's just more inventory for them to make significant money. And if the NFLPA signs off on it, and again, NFLPA will get money for this as well. I would think that schedule is going to expand. I mean, I would actually be stunned if in the next 3 to 5 years, it's not an 18-game schedule.
All right, let's move over to the NBA, which did get their Sunday encroached by their Sunday schedule encroached by the NFL, but they have a media deal coming up. I mean, within the next few months, you would think something would be announced. I mean, I know Mark Cuban's been talking about a streaming aspect. That's what you always say now with these new deals. There could be a streaming aspect. That's how you pump up the number, the total number you can get. Do you expect streaming? What streaming service do you think is live for this? And what is the streaming thing that would work for, like, what's the one that's going to be the next? Okay, that's the one we have to always get for sports. Where do you see that headed?
Yeah. So first, to answer your first part, I would be stunned, and I use that underline, if a streamer is not part of the NBA deal. Like if it turns out not to be the case, I honestly would be stunned. I almost think it's a fait accompli. And so I think the incumbents will retain in some form ESPN and Warner Brothers Discovery, Turner. I don't think that either perhaps will have as much inventory as they've had before, but they will still be principal sort of inventory partners. And I think ESPN, don't hold me to this, but I would still be surprised in this deal if they don't get the NBA Finals. Maybe somebody outbids them, but I would be very, very surprised. I think it's just too important to them. I think Amazon is your streamer that's going to be there. Now, is it possible Peacock or, Netflix or an Apple TV are sort of part of that? Of course. I mean, I think the NBA is going to be talking to everybody. And I shouldn't say going to be. They've already probably had conversations. But Amazon just makes sort of the most sense in terms of their global designs. They have proof of concept already with the NFL. So the NBA would not be worried about, can Amazon handle live sports? They certainly can. Amazon seems to sort of show interest in this. And so I would expect them to be there. And then I think they'll probably get a fourth partner. I know my colleague Andrew Marchand and John Oren and some others in the space have reported in the past about NBC. That's logical too, just given their history with the NBA. They have Peacock as well that could help sell that streamer. So the short answer, Tim, is if you are an NBA consumer and you want to watch every game, you are going to have to subscribe to one of these streaming service unless you've already subscribed to the service that ends up getting part of an NBA package. But there's no way they can get the increase that they want unless they bring in one of these streamers. They're not going to get the money they want unless they bring in one of these mega companies.
I haven't loved the Amazon productions for the NFL. I mean, I think Herb Street is not good, but that's me. On the NFL, I think he's a college guy who you can tell that he's had to study up on these games. That should come natural. That's just me, and we know
he won't be doing the NBA. Don't worry.
Yeah, but I do think listen, what their NBC production? Who's producing those games?
Amazon's now producing it on their own. They sort of used NBC for the sort of the proof of concept the first year. So they, I think their production, how it looked was great. I'm with you. I don't particularly love Herb Street as an NFL announcer, but if you watched Amazon, I think you'd have to concede, it doesn't look different than Fox or ESPN or CBS. You know what I'm saying? To me, it looks.
I agree.
Yeah. And
that's what I was going to say. I've been impressed by the production. I think it looks great on the streaming. Yeah, I think the Apple TV, I've been disappointed in on MLB, and that's why I'm not sure Apple is that sport. I don't know if they feel sports right now. I think Amazon, maybe just because they've done it for a couple of years. The Apple baseball, sometimes I have a hard time launching it. It seems to go backwards sometimes instead of getting the live thing.
Do you watch MLS? Are you into that on Apple?
I am not. So I don't. You have to get a subscription, right? So I'm not going to pay more.
I mean, and I think their MLS coverage has been pretty good. Mm-hmm. If you're a sports fan and you have Apple TV, that's kind of probably why you have Apple TV. Right. I think the MLB, I'm with you. It just feels like this, sort of odd, standalone stuff that they have, but they're not really invested in it. You know what I mean? It's just odd. Yeah,
I agree. So that worries me about, if they get into the basketball, if they get into football, will they do it similarly, where you just kind of feel apart from everything? Apart from everything is a good point. Is you are disconnected, and the Amazon NFL coverage, other than maybe, a few things I have, feels part of the whole picture, right? Mm-hmm. It feels this is the NFL and we're going to be part of it. We're slotting right in. It might be bigger, and I'd be fine if it was bigger. I think Jason Kelce should be their analyst, if you frankly. I think I would have done that, 3 months ago.
Could happen.
Maybe anyway. That'll be the case. I don't know. Yeah. Richard, all right, we've talked all these things. We could go on and on, but I don't want to take you forever. So I will ask you version of the question I asked everybody. Richard Deitsch, what's your favorite movie right now?
Oh, is it right now or is it all time?
Whatever way you want. I say right now, but it can be whatever era, whatever category you want to put it on. What's your favorite
Yeah,
movie?
so I'll give you my favorite movie sort of all time. And the reason I like this answer is because people always say, "Oh yeah, that was a good movie," but it's usually not somebody's favorite. My favorite movie is Witness with Harrison Ford and Kelly McGillis, where Harrison Ford is a detective in Philadelphia. Amish boy witnesses a murder. Turns out to be cops. Danny Glover is a dirty cop who killed somebody, and then Harrison Ford has to go to Amish country basically and hide out while these corrupt cops come to Amish country to try to kill him. I saw that movie when I was a kid, and I just loved it. I just thought like the Amish were kind of interesting. Harrison Ford as a cop in that setting was interesting. Obviously, Harrison Ford's gone on to, or probably at that point was a big star, but it's obviously done many things. So that is my directed by Peter Weir, who is a great
Peter Weir. Yeah.
So that is my sort of all-time favorite film. Would I say it's the best film of all time? I would not. You'd probably have to get into the Godfathers or whatever, Casablanca, whatever yours is. But that is my de facto favorite film, and many, when it comes to like Shawshank on one of the Turner stations, if Witness is on, no matter the channel, I'm probably hooked on it. Wherever it's playing.
That isn't on that much though, right? I mean, I don't really.
No, it's not a. It is not a rotational. It is not a rotational. So, but now that I have kids too, and now they just completed all the Star Wars movies. That was fun for me as well to go back and to watch all those films as well. So that was cool.
Those Harrison Ford non-Star Wars or Indiana Jones, they're underrated. Like obviously Blade Runner, Fugitive.
Fugitive's great. Yeah.
Presumed Innocent.
Even if it's like campy stuff like Air Force One is like fun to watch,
Yep. And Ford, like that's the thing is he's going to be remembered obviously for Han Solo, Indiana Jones, and he should be. But that kind of like middle stuff, I really like. Again, Fugitive is one of my favorite movies. Like if you ask me,
he was Jack Ryan in some of those films, right?
Early Clancy movies, he was Jack Ryan. I guess Baldwin first, then Ford, then whoever was after Ford. But
it's not Harrison Ford, but you know what an underrated film is? I think people obviously think it's a good film, but it probably maybe even deserves more acclaim because you mentioned Baldwin. Hunt for Red October is a great film.
Yep. Sean Connery. I mean, come on.
So good in that.
Yeah, that is a tight movie.
Yeah.
That's like I kind of feel like Clancy was a tight Clancy book, and then Clancy just kind of got they got thicker and thicker, and you're just trying to weed through stuff. And some of the movies get a little bit, I guess, Without Remorse was the one in Columbia, wherever it was, and that was pretty good. But I just think that was a tight, really, really focused book that turned into a very tight movie. The ending was weird, but
a little weird. Also, it's kind of amazing that like the start of that movie is in Russian and then it just flips to English, but you're still into it,
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm claustrophobic, so that the submarine stuff can get to me, but it made it move around enough. Like there's a couple submarine movies like I just had to stop watching because I'm a little claustrophobic and I don't love it. But that's a whole other thing. Richard, good stuff. I like talking mid-career Harrison Ford because there's other stuff like Frenzy. You ever see that one? Like the thriller in Europe? Yeah. There's a Frantic. There you go.
Frantic is again another underrated Harrison Ford film.
Yep. We're right in that. I'm right in there. I'm right in.
His wife goes missing, right? It's like an Ann Archer type of.
I don't think it's like she's out of the movie for 99% of it.
Exactly.
And he's wandering around somewhere in Europe, and he's just the panic of it was.
Yeah. His film. People should just go to his filmography. It's amazing. Also, like if you go way back when, like, what's the? I think it's a Coppola film with Ron Howard and Harrison Ford, like Sybil Shepherd. Why am I blanking? Anyway,
American Graffiti.
Yeah,
American Graffiti. Yeah,
the guy's filmography is absurd.
Yep. And he's different, I think, in every single one of them. That's what I appreciate. Like it's not Han Solo walking into these movies; it's a character.
Yeah,
Again, it's kind of like for me, it's like the in between. I know we did Jones quickly after Star Wars. It's not really chronologically in between. It just feels to me like there are these in between movies, and I can watch any single one. When you say Witness, it isn't on very much. It's like I would love to see that again, and I don't come across it. Maybe there's some deal with the studio or something, but I would love to watch that one again. I think I saw it.
I don't think I'm not even sure it's on Netflix. So like, I'm not sure where it is right now. Yeah.
Let's get Witness back and we'll do a rewatchable. Oh, wait a minute. That's another podcast. I'm sorry. But Richard and I can do something about that. Richard, always great to talk to you. Always like being in both companies. Let's try to get a third company that we
need
both
a third one.
by,
Yeah.
and we can do that.
I'll work on that. Good to be with you.
Richard. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Everybody, that's the show for today.